There is a better way to grow food, and I would like to share that with you. I'm Millie Downing, and I'm from Melbourne.
I'm Wendy Seabrook from Learning from Nature. So Millie, what brought you all the way from Melbourne to Hilltop Farm, which is outside Cooktown, to do an internship with Learning from Nature?
What brought me up here was I was trying to find a way to make growing food easier.
So what's your sort of take? What are the normal things that people do to get over this problem of just really having so many chores to do?
So on all the different farms and the gardens I've worked in, Naka Gardens, and in my home garden, the things that you do to reduce chores in the garden is weed mats, mulching, herbicides, things to reduce weeding, labour costs, those sorts of things. As well as honestly pushing your workers, getting your workers to work harder than they should be to keep up a healthy lifestyle, to make it sustainable, whether that's in a market garden or you're trying to grow food for your family. As well as trying to come up with systems to make it the most efficient possible.
Yeah, and so often we fall back on using, machinery and equipment, and which is sort of great. We've got all that to sort of help us, but they're all pumping out fossil fuels, and there's a huge amount of energy that's used up, a lot of fossil fuels and carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in their manufacturing as well, that we don't tend to sort of think about. So,
and there's a lot of upkeep as well, like the money that goes into that, training staff to operate machinery.
Yes,
it's still not sustainable in the long run. We shouldn't be at the point where we have to rely on intense machinery to farm, to grow food, to look after our properties, look after our gardens. Yeah, it's not going to work long term.
Yeah, and so that's what brought you to Hilltop Farm and Learning from Nature.
Indeed, that's definitely what brought me up here.
So it's been great having you here, and it's been great having you here, and we've it's been about 2.5 months. So can you share what is sort of the take homes? What would you do differently, having had this internship experience at Hilltop Farm?
What would I do differently? You've taught me a lot. You've really taught me a lot. Working with nature is going to change everything. How we would have worked on the farm and the other farms I've worked at, and how I would have approached my garden. I feel like we were always resisting nature, working against it, constantly fighting to keep it at bay. And you don't have to do that. You can let nature do the work for you. Is probably the biggest thing that I've learned from you up here. And work with nature to grow your food for you. And you're not exhausting yourself trying to keep weeds back and trying to keep make sure that your crops, all your seedlings survive all the pests. You're having a slug mania. And you're like, oh my God, I'm losing all my seedlings. And so we have to send workers out and try and get as many of them out as possible. Some people spray. I've not worked on places where you spray herbicides. And pesticides.
And you talked about the amount of time that you spent mulching.
Oh, so much time. Yeah. So much of my life mulching.
And I love that idea you shared one day about how potentially you could grow. I think you were saying like you could actually grow like a cover crop that you could harvest.
Yeah.
How was that going to work?
We used to tarp some of our beds in a rotation to kill all the weeds underneath, made it easier to plant seedlings into. But instead of doing that, we could have done cover crops that we could harvest from, which we were doing on a few beds, but I think doing it on all of them would have made a lot more sense. Probably a bigger thing though would be replacing weeding with growing a ground cover that we could harvest and use instead of mulching, instead of weeding, instead of whippersnippering. Really focusing on that and putting perennial plants in as well to grow alongside it. Basically take up the space that the weeds would be taking up with crops we can actually use and sell. And to a degree we were doing that. We were harvesting wood sorrel and other weeds that would come up and then we were selling them, but we never did that on purpose. And we could make so much more money, and we would have saved, I think, a lot of money on labor costs. But the biggest thing would be we'd be growing food and not being like, oh my god, our broccoli isn't going to make it. We need to like hoe the whole bed, 150 meter bed with hose, and it's just not sustainable. It's just it took what I love, growing food, and made it harder to love.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And you know, what you're talking about too is so sort of an innovative way too of using the cover crops. So often people will grow like a sort of ecological support species underneath their main crops. You know, legumes and ones that produce lots of ground cover. But the idea of actually growing a cover crop that you can harvest as it grows, which is basically you're chopping and dropping, but you're not actually doing the dropping, because you're dropping off some of the leaves, but you're taking off the others and selling them as a salad mix. Yeah. So
I've definitely used cover crops with different flower mixes and peas, and you can eat the flowers, so we'd sell them, pick them, but also having perennial plants there. And not just annual crops over and over. Having perennial crops, like we did have artichokes, which are a great perennial crop, and they're great at keeping weeds at bay. And we could let the weeds grow even, and they wouldn't overtake the crop. It's too strong and big and did its own thing.
We struggle to grow things, and you know, part of your internship was using the Ecological Farming Handbook.
Yes.
And the last chapter in the Ecological Farming Handbook is on co-creating with succession, and which is really working with nature, mimicking the changes that happen over time as the soil improves, and you start potentially adding layers to your system. Depending on whether you're in a desert, then the layers might be just, open scrub plants, to rainforest where you've got multi-layered systems. So often the food that we grow is the food that is grown in an early successional stage.
Yes.
And so when you talk about bringing in perennial food plants.
Yes, I mean adding layers. I mean adding more than just the annual crops at the beginning of an ecosystem recovering. I mean having later stages, so they're self-sufficient in a lot of ways, and that takes away a lot of the chores that we have to do. At the same time, you're making money, you're having less work to do, and you're getting more food. It makes sense.
When we start looking, of course, at things a little bit differently, and we don't maybe just focus on the tools or the regenerative practices that we're told to use, but we actually sort of think about, how can we learn and how can we work with nature? There's a little bit of risk involved. There's a need to sort of trial things. But there's also, it's like it's opening a big door to a whole lot of other opportunities, and it's lovely that you've just shared with us. So, and thank you for coming and staying with us at Hilltop Farm.